If you were a cricket fan back in the mid 90s, you would probably remember the Titan Cup and the South Africa tour of India that happened, which India won. And there was a commentator with a gentle voice, but an extremely engaging voice who would call on commentary from South Africa. Now, if we cut to 2000s and later on, there have been many South African commentators that have come to the fore, people like Sean Pollock, Mike Hisman, and many others. But for an average Indian cricket fan back in the 90s, the mid 90s, there was a cricket commentator who really engaged with the audience and captured the imagination of many people. It's an absolute delight for me to have Mr. Trevor Quirk, a South African cricket commentator and an expert on cricket with us. So thank you so much, Trevor, for joining.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure, and it's lovely to hear from you. Lovely to meet you.
Same here, Trevor. So I have the privilege and honor of calling Mr. Quirk as Trevor. So thank you for giving me that honor, Trevor. And I would like to start with a memory that I just shared a while ago about the South Africa-India Test series back in 96, 97. So there was a test match at Ahmedabad, and India was in a very bad situation. We were defending only 170, and Javagal Srinath started the first over. And there was Trevor's commentary on air, and when South Africa lost a couple of wickets, he said that South Africa have lost 2 wickets without a run on the board, and that particular line still stands in the memory as I keep watching those videos time and again. So, Trevor, it's an absolute honor for me to have you on show, and my friend Srinivasan, unfortunately, is not able to join, but I'm sure that he's also giving his regards to you. So, once again, a great honor to have you.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure.
So, Trevor, I would like to start this interview by asking about you. So, where were you born, and how did you? What were your first memories of cricket?
Well, I'm really an Irishman, but my father came out to South Africa. He was a farmer in Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and he loved the country so much, and he decided to buy a farm. And so I was actually conceived in Ireland, traveled across the waters inside mother, and was born in South Africa, in one of South Africa's joke towns called Naboomspruit, which means near Tree River. And that's where I grew up. But fortunately, my father sent me to Pretoria to go to an English primary school, because there's only an Afrikaans primary school in Naboomspruit. And at boarding school, I quickly developed a love for the game of cricket. And I had a wonderful coach there. And from very young age, I was already playing in the first team cricket. And it blossomed from there. And I went to high school and I played many years there, in the first team again, very young. And then I got picked for my provincial schools, and so went to the South African Schools Tournament. And then eventually I ended up playing for Northern Transvaal, as my province was called then. It's now the Titans, as everything has changed. But I played 9 seasons of first-class cricket for Northern Transvaal as a wicketkeeper batsman. So that's where my real love of the game exploded. But it was a very funny situation, because I used to listen passionately to the radio commentaries of the day, and our great commentator in South Africa was Charles Fortune. And I used to, at boarding school, those wonderful test matches you play with your mates on the front lawn of the boarding house, I used to mimic all the commentators: Charles Fortune, John Arlott from the BBC, and Brian Johnston, and Andy McGilvray, the Australian commentator of the time. And when I was a little boy in Standard 7, I actually wrote to Charles Fortune, and I said to him, one day, Mr. Fortune, I want to be like you. And he wrote me the most discouraging letter back to say, there's no commentator in the world under the age of 30, and you need to study English, and you need to travel the world and become worldly wise and all this sort of thing. And I thought, oh, well, I'll never achieve that. So when I finished school, I said to my dad, well, take me to the university in Johannesburg and I'll sign up to do law, with the idea of becoming an advocate. And then I said to him, we've come all the way from the farm, so just take me to the SABC, the South African Broadcasting Corporation. I just want to go there and see somebody. And I did, and I gave them the long story about how far I'd come from, the farm. And they amazingly agreed to interview me straight away, put me through an aptitude test, and they offered me a job as a sound operator to start in a couple of months' time. And I'd leapt at it. My parents were horrified because they said, no, you're going to university first. I promised them I'd do my degree through UNISA, as we call it, the University of South Africa, which is, by remote, and which I did. And once you got the degree, only then was I allowed to become a full-time broadcaster in the old rules. And then I had to do an audition, and I passed that, and I became a broadcaster at the age of 23. And then because of my background of playing provincial cricket and all that, first class cricket, the boss of sport on radio, and we had no television in those days, he said to me, I'd like you to start doing some cricket. And so the next thing there I was working with the great Charles Fortune, who told me, written me this discouraging letter. And from there, my commentary career just blossomed through radio and into television eventually. And what a life it's been.
Wonderful. So, Trevor, we will come to the commentary part in a bit, but I would like you to give us a sense of how South African society was, because obviously you have lived through the apartheid, and we hear a lot of stories about, and we as students in school and universities, we get to read about it. But for someone who actually lived in that country, give us a sense of how the society at that time was. How were you? What were your views on that? And how obviously South Africa was not allowed to have a cricket team during that whole era. So how did that affect cricket in the domestic structure? So how was it all?
Well, it was absolutely tragic from a cricket point of view, from a sports point of view, because the apartheid era and the national government that we had, many of us disagreed with it. And I know my parents voted against that party whenever there were elections. And I grew up in two very good schools where basically we didn't approve of it. But there was nothing we could do about it. And that was the tragedy of it all. And, I remember in 1966, 67, we had a test series in South Africa where South Africa thrashed Bobby Simpson's Australian team. And then England was supposed to come to South Africa in 1968. And the Basil de Oliveira affair took place, where he was chosen to come and play on the tour, the England tour. And our apartheid government and the president at the time, John Foster, said that's a political choice, and therefore he's not welcome in this country. And he was a South African from Cape Town, but he was a colored man. And he said he will not be allowed to come here. And if England persists, England will not be welcome. So in the end, the tour never took place. But the Australians came back again in 69, 70 under Bill Lorry, and we thrashed them 4-0 in the series. And then, of course, we picked a team to go to Australia, and then this whole business kicked in where South Africa was isolated and kicked out of world cricket. And for 22 long years, we had no official international cricket. And it was a tragedy because we had such a fantastic team in 1969, 70, when we thrashed the Aussies, with the great Graeme Pollock and Barry Richards and Michael Proctor and all those, one of Eddie Barler. unbelievable. And the other thing was that was so tragic. We never had played the West Indies or, India and Pakistan, those countries. We'd never played them. And the West Indies, of course, were at the height of their powers with those wonderful array of fast bowlers. And what a test series that would have been, between us and the West Indies. And great players that India had, like Sunny Gavaskar and those sort of, we never got to play against them. We never saw them. And it was absolutely tragic. And then, of course, things changed when Nelson Mandela was freed, and the whole negotiation for open elections started, whereas the non-white people of South Africa, Indians, coloureds, black people, were not allowed to vote. It was now agreed that they would vote. And so because of that, we were allowed back into international cricket in 1991, which is when we came to India. And it was incredible. After India had strongly and rightly opposed South African cricket and boycotted us, suddenly they hosted us for the first ever re-entry into world cricket. And we played just 3 one-day internationals in Calcutta, in Gwalior, and in Delhi. And it was the most wonderful experience. I mean, that first one-day match in Calcutta with over 100,000 people, I've never seen anything like it. It was, and as a young commentator, it was just the most wonderful experience. But the sad thing is that as a player, I played cricket at first-class level in a time when I couldn't represent my country. And I always felt very aggrieved about that. But at last we got back into international cricket, and those first 3 matches, and then was followed by our first ever test match, which funnily enough was against the West Indies in Barbados. And for me, that was just an amazing experience. And from there, it exploded, and we went to the World Cup in 1994, and then obviously India. We played India in the first test series that we'd ever played against India. And that was, in Ahmedabad, as you say, in Calcutta and Nagpur.
Kanpur.
And and then India, almost 2 weeks later, came to South Africa. And to have them in our country, the great players of that time, Tendulkar and Azharuddin and all those great players, it was just the most wonderful experience. And, since then, we've never looked back.
Yes, great. So I'd like to jog your memory back a little bit to the 2 names that you took, Graeme Pollock and Barry Richards. And, when we talk about, like my generation people, when we hear about great South African players of the past, these 2 are the names that constantly are spoken of. So I was looking at Barry Richards' record. I mean, he played only 4 test matches. And as you rightly said, the apartheid robbed a lot of players of many test matches, and Barry Richards was one of them. And the other one, of course, Graeme Pollock, who played slightly more matches. But still, great record. What was your what were your memories of interacting with these 2 gentlemen, and how? I mean, why are they regarded as the greats in South African cricket?
Well, I mean, I played against both of them. In fact, Barry Richards was the sort of just a year older than me, and so I played against him at school level, and he was already a genius. And then I eventually played first-class cricket for Northern Transvaal against Graeme Pollock, who was playing for Eastern Province, and then he moved to Transvaal. And of course, Barry Richards, who played for Natal, and the great Mike Proctor. And, Mike Proctor played county cricket for Gloucestershire, and they called it Proctorshire because he was so dominant a force in that particular county. And he played first for Rhodesia, our neighbors here now, Zimbabwe, and then he went back and played for Natal. So I played against those three great gentlemen often. And Graeme Pollock and Barry Richards were two different type of geniuses. Barry Richards was the most beautifully correct sort of manual, cricket manual type batsman with a fantastic eye and a beautiful array of shots. Graeme Pollock was unorthodox, but an absolute genius in his own right. And to play against them, you just wished and prayed you got them out early, because otherwise they seriously punished you. And they were two different geniuses. And, I just loved them. And often you wonder which one was the better one. Well, I can't really say. And at the same time, I came across and saw, as I commentated, other great players. I mean, like Sachin Tendulkar, and Mohammad Azharuddin was one of my favorites. He had a class about him, a sort of way about him, stylish way about him, that used to enchant me. And sadly for us, he got a lot of runs against us on occasion. So there are many wonderful, wonderful cricketers that I've had the privilege of playing with, against, and then to commentate on. And as you say, Barry Richards, the tragedy is he only played those 4 test matches in that 69-70 series against Australia when we beat them 4-0. Mike Proctor only played 7 tests because he did play in the previous tour against Bobby Simpson 3 test matches and then 4 with Barry. Graeme Pollock played 23, but he could have played so many more, obviously, if it hadn't been for apartheid and for our isolation. And what a tragedy.
Right. So we go back a few years after that, and we talk about the readmission of South Africa into international cricket. And we saw some greats of South African cricket in the 90s, Trevor. We saw Jonty Rhodes, Hansie Cronje, the captain who led from the front in so many series, Gary Kirsten and Jacques Callis, and so many. In that era, when South Africa re-entered, who was, according to you, the most watchable cricketer and the one whom you really loved watching play?
Well, obviously, there are some people that when I first came across Gary Kirsten, I didn't think he was going to make it. I thought he was a sort of journeyman first-class cricketer. And of course, he ended up playing over 100 test matches. And he made a double 100 in a test against India, 100 in each innings. And he was just such a solid player and a wonderful player. Hansie Cronje had incredible flair, but as a leader too, he was an amazing person. He, in fact, ended up as the captain, top batsman, and the coach. I mean, he could do everything, and the media liaison officer. That's how incredible a human being it was. But, I think Jacques Callis emerged to me at the end of the day as the finest player we've had since Barry Richards, Graeme Pollock, and Mike Proctor. He was an unbelievable batsman, and a very useful bowler who fell just short of 300 test wickets. He was a brilliant fielder in the slips, and he made the more runs than any other South African has made. And and people always debate this, and I don't think it's fair ever to compare era against era. I think each era has its own place. And so people are always saying now, who was the greatest all-rounder that ever lived? And a lot of people will say Gary Sobers. But if you look at Jacques Callis's record, it surpasses Gary Sobers by quite some margin. So there's every argument for he was the greatest test player or all-rounder of all time. But as I say, I think it's odious to, sort of compare era with era. But certainly Jacques Kallis, I think, emerged as our finest player once we got back into isolation.
Fair call. So I'd just like you to shed some light now, Trevor, on South Africa's performance in global tournaments. Now, I would not like to use the C word, but we all know that how South Africa increasingly has failed to deliver and flattered to deceive, especially in the 90s when they had a much stronger team than what they have now. So, what do you think, Trevor, according to you, has been probably, if you can point out one or two reasons why South Africa has not yet won a World Cup?
Well, I know that dreadful C word, the choke, and it's just incredible that they haven't. I mean, they've been there. And then, Lance Klusener in 1999, he hit the first two balls the last over for four. So he had 4 balls in which to make 1 run. And he called for the most stupid run that saw Alan Donald run out. And we lost to Australia when we had every chance of going to win that World Cup. And, I just can't, none of us can really, who love the game and have been involved in the game for so long, none of us can really put our fingers on why South Africa, when it comes to the World Cup, has never achieved what they should have achieved, their potential. They've never fulfilled it. And not only in the World Cup, but in T20 World Cup cricket as well. And it's just been desperately disappointing, and you can't actually put your finger on what it is. In latter times now, for instance, as much as I absolutely hated apartheid and it caused us all sorts of problems, and I am in no way a racist, because I believe in equality to everybody. And way back on the farm, my only friends on the farm were little black boys, and I used to fish with them, hunt with them, ride horses with them, and then make them play motor cars with me, And we had a wonderful relationship. I speak their language, and all that sort of thing. But in now South Africa, South African cricket is in a bad way, administratively, and that rubs off on the players. There's no money in South Africa. If it wasn't for the South African players earning what they do in the IPL, and now as we've got the T20 in South Africa at the moment, and things like the Big Bash and all those sort of things in Australia, we would be in serious trouble, because there's just not the money in South Africa, and the money has been misrepresented, so we say, in many ways. And to me, there's now reverse racism in a way, where they're insistent on there being so many players of color in a South African team. And that's problematic. Always it should be a team picked on merit. Now, of course, it wasn't in the bad old days of apartheid, because somebody like Basil de Oliveira, for instance, had to go and play county cricket for Worcestershire in England to fulfill his ambitions and his abilities, whereas he should have been playing for South Africa. But because of apartheid, he couldn't. Now, there are many white fellows, young white cricketers, that are leaving South Africa because they're not getting a fair deal because of their color. So it's a reverse situation. And I think it is impacting on our standards of cricket in South Africa. And it's detrimental to us achieving what we want to do. I mean, for instance, coming up now, we've got this T20 here in South Africa, which the irony of it is every team, all 6 teams, are owned by Indian franchises. So you've got the Mumbai Indians, Cape Town, which is, yeah, you've got the Eastern Cape Sunrisers, and so it goes on. And the test team that is now about to leave for New Zealand has been decimated because the players are taking advantage of earning money in this T20 and not playing for South Africa in the upcoming series, 2 test matches in New Zealand. We are sending like a B team to New Zealand, which I think is an insult to New Zealand and is an insult to world test cricket. And it's all because things just aren't seem to be managed properly, that, you know, the T20 here should be allowed to clash with a test cricket tour to India, I mean, to New Zealand. So it's not a very good state of affairs.
Yes, Trevor, you have touched upon the modern issues that are there in cricket, especially in Test cricket, and of course the fact that South Africa is sending a B team to New Zealand, and their captain is someone who hasn't not even debuted in Test cricket. So that's the state of.
No.
So Trevor, while I mean this debate can carry on, and we can talk about it till the cows come home, but I would like you to talk a little bit about commentary now, Trevor. You know, so of course, my first memory of you was as a cricket commentator. How was your experience of commentating? What were the challenges that you faced, and how do you see commentary different now than it was probably back in the 90s?
Well, there's, to me, quite a big difference in that I think, you know, you always had what I refer to as a professional broadcaster that anchored the team. And then you would have maybe 1 or 2 what we call expert opinions, were, you know, ex-test players or ex-top players or whatever. But these days, you can get a team of commentators that are all ex-test players. And some of them are not very good broadcasters. Whereas, you know, somebody like Charles Fortune, who was my mentor and tutor, his command of the English language was unbelievable, and his ability to paint pictures. And I remember the second time I worked with him as a young 23-year-old, I never slept the night before. We had to do the broadcast at the Wanderers in Johannesburg because I was so nervous. And on the second day of the match, I said to him, you know, Mr. Fortune, I once wrote you a letter when I was a young boy of 14. And, oh, yes, he says, I remember that. And I thought, really? And I said, but you wrote me a most discouraging letter back. He says, oh, yes, he said, anyway, let's get on with it. The next day, he arrived in the commentary box with the letter that I had written to him all those years ago. I couldn't believe it, but he taught me so much, how you paint a picture. And the next time I worked with him, we used to get telegrams coming into the commentary box. That's before cell phones and WhatsApps and, you know, all those sort of things. And he, as the senior commentator, used to go through those telegrams, and most of them ended up in file 13, the dustbin, but he'd keep 1 or 2 and he'd read them out on the air. And then I saw him one day push one aside, and he got up and he went to the gents. And while he was away, I took a look at it. And then I realized why he might not have read it. And when he came back, I confessed him. I said, Mr. Fortune, and I never called him anything but Mr. Fortune, even on the air. And I said to him, while you were away, I took a little look at that telegram, and I would like to read it out. And Oh, he said, do what you will, Trev. And I read it out. And it came from a blind home. And all it said was, dear Mr. Fortune, when you are on the air, we see. Now that is to me the ultimate compliment for a commentator, especially in the old radio days. Of course, television is a totally different thing, because Charles Fortune could never adapt to television, because he would be commentating on all sorts of things and the director was shouting in his ear, look at your monitor, because they were playing a slow motion replay of something. And Charles was talking about the lady in the pink hat, and all this sort of thing. And he couldn't adapt to television. So he was a bad television broadcaster, a genius radio commentator. And today, the television, there are too many ex-players who are not very good broadcasters that are, and we have it in South Africa as well. And and nobody seems to train them, which is, I find extraordinary. When I became head of television sport in South Africa eventually, I used to hold workshops for the commentators and basically had a list of do's and don'ts. And these days I speak to some of them have asked me to help them. And I said to them, but surely there's somebody, at your television station helping you, whether it be the South African Broadcasting Corporation or SuperSport. They said, no, we never hear from anybody. We just get on with it. And, you need to be trained in many ways to be a good broadcaster.
True, absolutely. Yeah, that's fascinating. What the anecdote that you shared about the telegram that came from the blind home. It's amazing, and that's definitely the ultimate compliment for any cricket commentator. Trevor, you have traveled to India many times. Would you like to share some interesting memories of yours? Any cultural shocks that you got when you came to India? Any interesting, nice memory that you'd like to share about India?
Well, I'm very fond of going to India. And I've been, I think, 5 different times on tour to India. And I always remember that first one, of course, us back in international cricket. But we landed in Calcutta. And as we walked down the stairs from the aeroplane, we didn't have to go through customs and all that sort of thing. I mean, we got VIP treatment. But as we came down, a wreath was placed over each one of us, not only the players, but us and the media and the broadcasters, the journalists and everybody. And then we got onto the bus and we traveled into Calcutta from the airport. I couldn't believe the streets were lined with people. And we twice had to stop at main sort of points along the road, which had been deliberately set up with a stage and everything else. And Clive Rice, who was the captain, had to make a speech. And Ali Bacher, of course, who was president of, not president of South African cricket at the time, but the man in charge of South African cricket. And we eventually got to our hotel, the Oberoi Grand, I think, in Calcutta. And then that experience, as I described, of over 100,000 people. Now, what I remember, and we sometimes still talk about it with some of the players that were playing in that South African team, like Andrew Hudson and Jimmy Cook, who opened the batting on that day. But Clive Rice led the team out onto the field, and they stood in a circle. And at his command, they all went namaskar like this. And, the place exploded. And I think from that day on, there's been a tremendous affinity between India and South Africa. And what always amazed me was when I was in India, I mean, cricket is a religion to you in India. And you know, wherever you go, you are known. Even though, you know, complete foreigner from South Africa, everybody seemed to know you. And you were treated, you know, like gods. And I mean, it was just the most amazing experience. And wherever you go and have been, wherever I've been in India, I've had the most wonderful reception and the most wonderful experiences in some of those test matches and those one-day internationals, like the Titan Cup, which you mentioned earlier. They've all been just amazing, and I just love the love of cricket in India. I mean, in Calcutta, I remember the most astonishing thing. I looked out, there was 80,000 people in the ground, and I looked out, and there's a park next to Eden Gardens. And there must have been another 2,500 people standing in the park just outside the stadium with their radios on their shoulders. And every time there was a cheer in the ground, they cheered and they were listening to the radio. And I thought, what an atmosphere, you know, it's just amazing. And to this day, I think South Africa and India have a wonderful relationship in cricket. And I know that in India, certain players like Clive Rice, also Jonty Rhodes, Gary Kirsten, of course, who coached India to that wonderful triumph. And Gary lives here in Cape Town with me, and we're big friends. You know, there's so many of them that were revered by Indians and in India. And even Graeme Smith. I mean, the only reason why this T20 here in South Africa now is successful is because of Graeme Smith's relationship with people in India, like Ganguly, for instance. And as I say, all the franchises are named after Indian franchises.
Right.
And it's just a wonderful relationship, and I loved going there. I'm sad now that I'm old and retired.
No, but it's amazing, Trevor, that you've shared memories. And I know we are a little short on time, but I would like you to maybe very briefly touch upon two individuals that you know, I've really admired. One is, of course, Mr. Nelson Mandela. I would like you to share maybe a small memory of maybe probably your interaction with him, as well as a certain late Mr. Robin Jackman, because I know that that you used to have a program with him some many years ago, and Robin Jackman has been one of my favorite commentators. So if you can just share your memories of interacting with these two gentlemen.
Well, you know, Robin Jackman was my best friend. Very simple. And on Christmas Day, this last year, was the 3rd anniversary of his death. And 5 days before that, he'd been here at my home to lunch. And then he had a bit of a pulmonary thrombosis problem. So he was on oxygen, but then he got COVID, and that just finished him off within 4 days. It was, I still miss him hugely. And our relationship started when he, who played for Surrey, of course, for 19 seasons.
Right.
Robin also played for Rhodesia, as it was in those days, now Zimbabwe, with Mike Proctor, and they were a formidable team. And we played against each other because they actually played in our Currie Cup here, which was our first-class competition. And that's where I first learnt or got to know him, is when I played against him. And then, of course, when he stopped playing and he finished doing some coaching down here, Western Province in Cape Town, I suggested to him that he might try his hand at commentary. And he was an absolute natural. And then we toured South Africa and the world together as commentators, and we became the best of friends. And he was without a doubt my greatest friend, and I miss him dearly to this day. And I know that I've just erected a plaque for him, in fact, at Newlands Cricket Ground, here in Cape Town. And what I agreed with his wife to put on that was cricketer and commentator of consequence, because it rhymed a bit in alliteration. But that said what a great cricketer he was, what a good commentator he was. And I will always remember him, and people loved him, not only in South Africa, but wherever he went to commentate. So he's sadly missed. And Mr. Nelson Mandela, wow. I mean, how lucky South Africa was that there was a man of such stature who spent 27 years on a little island just here off Cape Town, Robben Island, in prison. And when he eventually was freed, he did not in any way take a vengeance on those who had incarcerated him, the system of the day. He opposed apartheid, yes, but he embraced change, and it became all-inclusive. And he saved us from what could have been a nasty civil war, to be honest. And the stature of the man is just so remarkable that he deservedly is world renowned as one of the great statesmen of all time. And yet he was such a humble person. And I remember we have a race here called the Comrades Marathon, from Durban to Pietermaritzburg, and the next year it's Pietermaritzburg down to Durban, and it's nearly 90 kilometers. It's a famous race that's been going on for over 100 years. And Nelson, I was doing the finish, and I was down at the finish line because I didn't only do cricket, I did every sport conceivable. And Mr. Mandela came down to present the wreaths to the men's winner and the ladies' winner. And when he'd done the ladies as after the men's, because there's quite a big difference of about half an hour between the two, but he stayed there with me on the finish line. I then said to him, I need to do an interview with you. And he said, I'd love to. He said, because I loved running too. I said to him, but I thought you were a boxer. He said, oh yes, I was a boxer as well. And he did the most beautiful interview with me there to finish. Then he took the microphone and he started interviewing me. And that's the sort of human being he was. He was a humble, wonderful human being, a great statesman, and he rescued South Africa. And I will forever be indebted to him and in admiration of a great man.
Great, wonderful. I think on that remarkable note, Trevor, we'll end this interview. Thank you so much for your precious time. Really appreciate that. And I'm sure that listeners who have watched this and viewers who have watched this episode would take back something really enriching, because we do miss genuinely wonderful cricket commentators like you in today's day and age. So please take care of yourself, and I hope to keep in touch with you.
Look forward to you coming to South Africa and meeting up with you in person. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Trevor. And thank you to my audience. And till the next time we see. Bye.